My name is Daniel Foster, and for 11 months I lived through a nightmare that started with a piece of concrete and ended with a woman losing everything she had spent a decade building. This is the story of how one HOA board president tried to force me to tear out my own driveway, how she nearly succeeded, and how a single dusty folder in a county records office turned the entire situation upside down. I want to say upfront that this isn't a story about hating homeowners associations. Plenty of them do good work, keeping neighborhoods tidy and property value stable. This is a story about what happens when one person is handed a small amount of power and decides that power has no limits. If you've ever dealt with a neighbor, a board member, or an authority figure who seem to enjoy the fight more than the actual issue, you'll recognize the pattern here immediately. Let's start from the beginning. Moving in. My wife Rachel and I bought our house in a community called Willow Creek Estates almost 3 years ago. It was a newer development, maybe 6 years old at the time, with about 240 homes arranged around 3 cul-de-sacs and a small retention pond that the developer liked to call a lake in the marketing brochures. We fell in love with the house the moment we saw it. It had a wide, welcoming driveway that curved slightly to the left before meeting the garage, framed by a strip of landscaping the previous owners had clearly put real effort into. The house had been built by the original developer, and everything about it, the driveway included, matched what was shown in the property disclosure packet we received at closing. We didn't think twice about it. Why would we? A driveway is a driveway. It was already there when we bought the place, already paved, already part of the deal. For the first year, everything was quiet. We met our neighbors, joined the community Facebook group, went to a couple of the low-key summer barbecues the HOA organized near the pond. It felt like the kind of neighborhood people dream about when they picture raising a family. I even volunteered to help paint the community mailbox kiosk one weekend. I tell you all this because I want you to understand that we were not troublemakers. We were not the family everyone whispered about. We were about as unremarkable and rule-following as homeowners get. Then, in our second year, the HOA held its annual board elections, and a woman named Linda Wexler became president. Enter Linda. I need to be fair here, because even now, after everything that happened, I don't think Linda started out as a bad person. I think she genuinely believed she was protecting the neighborhood. But something happens to certain people when they're given a title and a clipboard. Linda had lived in Willow Creek longer than almost anyone, having bought one of the very first homes when the development broke ground. She knew every bylaw, every covenant, every fine print clause in the governing documents, and she wielded that knowledge like a weapon. Within her first 3 months as president, the tone of the neighborhood changed. Violation notices started appearing on doors for things that had never been an issue before: a trash can left out 4 hours past the pickup window, a basketball hoop positioned 2 feet closer to the street than the guidelines technically allowed, a flagpole that was supposedly the wrong shade of bronze. People grumbled, but most just complied to avoid the hassle. Fines were small at first, $25 here, $50 there, and most residents decided it wasn't worth fighting over. I noticed the shift, but it didn't touch us directly until the spring of our third year. The notice. It arrived on a Tuesday, tucked into a bright orange envelope stapled to our front door, the kind of envelope that immediately makes your stomach drop before you've even read a word. The notice stated that our driveway was in violation of Section 4.3 of the Willow Creek Estates Design Guidelines, which apparently required all driveways to be constructed with a minimum 18-inch decorative border using approved paver materials. Our driveway, poured as one continuous slab of standard concrete, did not meet this requirement. We were given 30 days to bring the driveway into compliance or face escalating fines, followed by potential legal action to compel removal and reconstruction at our expense. I remember standing in the driveway holding that letter, reading it 3 times, convinced I was misunderstanding something. The driveway had been there since before we bought the house. It looked exactly like at least a dozen other driveways on our street. I called Rachel outside, and she read it too, and her first reaction was the same as mine. "This has to be a mistake," she said. "Nobody else has pavers on their driveway." She was right. I walked the block that evening, phone in hand, taking photos. Out of the 18 homes on our stretch of street, only 3 had the decorative paver border the notice was demanding. The rest, like ours, had plain poured concrete. It made no sense that we would be singled out unless something else was going on. The first meeting. I called the HOA management office the next morning and asked for clarification. The woman on the phone was polite but clearly overwhelmed, explaining that violation notices were compiled and approved directly by Board President Linda Wexler, and that any dispute would need to go through the formal appeals process, which meant appearing before the board at the next scheduled meeting, 6 weeks away. 6 weeks felt absurd for something this small, but I didn't want an unresolved violation sitting on our record, so I requested the meeting slot and started gathering what documentation I could find. I dug through our closing paperwork, hoping our home inspection report or property disclosure would mention the driveway specifications. I found references to the driveway's material and condition, but nothing that definitively addressed the paver border question one way or another. The night of the meeting, Rachel and I sat in a row of folding chairs in the clubhouse function room along with about a dozen other residents there for their own disputes. When our name was called, I walked up to a small podium facing a table where 5 board members sat, Linda directly in the center. I explained the situation as calmly as I could. I told them the driveway had been there since before we purchased the home, that it matched the finish of numerous other driveways in the neighborhood, and that enforcing a retroactive material requirement on something original to the property's construction seemed unreasonable, especially when so many similar driveways existed without penalty. Linda's response was immediate and rehearsed, like she had been waiting for exactly this argument. The design guidelines apply to every lot in this community regardless of when the home was built, she said. Ignorance of a requirement is not an exemption from a requirement. As for other properties, if they are also out of compliance, they will receive their own notices in due course. That is not relevant to your case. I pushed back, pointing out that if the guidelines truly required this feature on every driveway, it was strange that so few homes actually had it, suggesting the rule might never have been consistently enforced, or might not have applied to originally built driveways at all. Linda cut me off. The board has reviewed your file and the violation stands. You have 30 days from tonight to submit a compliance plan or the fine schedule will begin, followed by a formal lien process if necessary. I sat back down next to Rachel, stunned. It wasn't just the decision that bothered me. It was the tone. Linda hadn't looked at a single piece of paper before responding. She'd had her answer ready before I even opened my mouth. Digging in. That night, unable to sleep, I started doing what I probably should have done from the very beginning. Real research, not just into our specific driveway, but into the actual history of Willow Creek Estates itself. I learned that our development had been approved by the County Planning Commission almost 7 years earlier, and that any residential subdivision of that size would have required an approved site plan on file with the county before a single permit was issued. Site plans, I discovered, are public record. They show exactly what a developer proposed and what the county approved, right down to driveway dimensions, materials, and landscaping requirements for each lot. If our driveway had been built exactly as originally approved by the county, and if that approved plan made no mention of a decorative paver border, then the HOA's claim that we were somehow violating a retroactive design guideline became a lot shakier. More importantly, if the developer's own approved plan and the recorded HOA design guidelines conflicted with each other, that raised serious questions about which document actually controlled what residents were required to build. The next morning, I drove to the County Planning and Zoning Office. I explained what I was looking for to a clerk behind the counter, and after about 20 minutes of searching through their digital archive, she pulled up the original approved site plan for our subdivision, filed under the developer's name from the initial construction phase. There it was, page 14 of the packet, a detailed lot-by-lot layout including driveway specifications. Our lot was clearly labeled. The driveway was drawn as a standard poured concrete slab with no border treatment specified, and identical driveway notations appeared across the majority of lots in the first 2 phases of construction. A note at the bottom of the page indicated that decorative paver borders were an optional upgrade available only for lots in Phase 3, built roughly a year and a half after our section, and only for buyers who selected that feature during initial construction. In other words, the 18-inch paver border wasn't a universal requirement at all. It was an optional feature added later in the development's timeline, only ever meant for a portion of the neighborhood. The HOA's design guidelines, apparently drafted or revised sometime after the original construction phases were already complete, appeared to have generalized a Phase 3 feature into a blanket rule without accounting for the fact that most of the existing homes, including mine, had been built under an entirely different and already approved plan. I paid $11 for certified copies of every relevant page, my hands actually shaking a little as the clerk stamped them. Before I left the office, I asked the clerk one more question, almost as an afterthought, whether HOAs were required to file their own governing documents and design guidelines with the county as well. She explained that recorded declarations and covenants often were on file, since they typically got attached to the property records when a development was first platted, but that internal guideline updates adopted later by a board weren't always recorded the same way. That distinction turned out to matter more than I realized at the time. It meant there would eventually be two separate paper trails I could compare: what the county said had been approved and built, and what the HOA itself had recorded as binding on homeowners. If those two trails disagreed with each other, the county's version, tied to the actual permitted construction, was going to carry a lot more weight than an internal guideline document the board could quietly revise whenever it wanted. Gathering more ground. Certified copies in hand, I didn't want to walk back into another HOA meeting and simply argue my case verbally again. I wanted this to be airtight. Over the following 2 weeks, I put together a full comparison packet. I photographed our driveway from multiple angles with a tape measure showing its dimensions matched the recorded site plan almost to the inch. I pulled up the county's approved subdivision phase map, which clearly divided the development into 3 construction phases with our home falling in phase 1. I cross-referenced the current HOA design guidelines document, noting the date it had been formally adopted by the board, 3 years after our section of the neighborhood was fully built and sold. I also went back through the neighborhood, this time systematically, photographing every driveway on our 3 cul-de-sacs and noting which ones had the paver border. The pattern was unmistakable. Every single home with the decorative border was located in the Phase 3 section. Every home without it, including ours, sat in Phases 1 and 2. It wasn't a random smattering of compliant and non-compliant homes. It was a clean, obvious line matching exactly what the original developer's plan had laid out years before Linda or the current board had any involvement in the neighborhood. I reached out to a real estate attorney a friend had recommended, mostly just to get a professional opinion before my next move. I paid for a single consultation, laid out everything I had found, and asked her directly, could the HOA legally force me to install a feature that wasn't part of the original approved construction, based on a rule adopted years after my home was built? She was fairly direct in her answer. HOA design guidelines generally cannot be applied retroactively to compel structural changes to elements that were part of the home's original, county-approved construction, unless the governing declaration specifically reserved that right and provided fair notice at the time of any rule change, along with a reasonable grandfathering process for existing non-conforming structures. She asked to see the HOA's governing declaration, which I had actually already requested and received from the management company. After reviewing it, she pointed out that the declaration did contain a grandfather clause, stating explicitly that any structure or feature legally in place prior to a guideline's adoption date would be considered legally non-conforming and could not be forced into retroactive compliance unless it posed a genuine safety hazard. Our driveway, built and approved years before the paver guideline existed, fell squarely under that protection. She offered to draft a formal letter on my behalf, citing the county site plan, the phase construction records, and the HOA's own grandfather clause. I agreed immediately. The letter. While we waited on a formal response, I kept myself busy doing something I probably should have done much earlier, talking to my neighbors directly instead of just observing their driveways from a sidewalk. I knocked on a handful of doors in Phases 1 and 2, explaining what I had found at the county office and asking if anyone else had received a similar notice. 3 households told me they had gotten nearly identical violation letters within the past year. 2 of them had simply paid the fine outright rather than deal with the hassle of contesting it. The third, an older gentleman named Walter who had lived in the neighborhood since it was first built, told me he'd actually tried to argue his case at a board meeting the previous fall, only to be told by Linda that his objection was noted but not accepted, and that continued non-compliance would result in escalating penalties. He'd eventually caved and paid a contractor to install the border rather than keep fighting. Hearing that made the whole situation feel less like an isolated misunderstanding and more like a pattern, and it strengthened my resolve to see this through properly rather than just quietly negotiating a private resolution for our own household alone. The letter went out by certified mail to the HOA management company and the board of directors 2 weeks before my scheduled follow-up appearance, which had been forced by Linda's insistence that a second hearing was required before any fine reduction could even be considered. I didn't hear anything back directly, but word apparently traveled fast within the small management company that handled several HOAs in the area. A property manager named Carla called me personally about 4 days later, her tone noticeably different from our earlier interactions. "Mr. Foster, I want to let you know we received the documentation from your attorney," she said. "I've reviewed it along with our legal counsel, and I think there may have been an oversight on our end regarding how the guideline was being applied to Phase 1 and Phase 2 properties." It was the first honest acknowledgement I had gotten from anyone connected to the HOA since the whole ordeal began. She explained that management-level staff hadn't been aware the paver border had originally been an optional Phase 3 upgrade rather than a universal requirement, and that the guideline document itself, as written, was ambiguous on that point. She said the matter would need to go before the full board rather than being resolved through her office alone, since Linda as president had personally issued the original violation and would need to be present for any formal reversal. That was fine with me. In fact, I wanted Linda present. I wanted her to see the county records with her own eyes. The second meeting. The clubhouse was noticeably fuller for this meeting than the first one. Word had apparently spread through the neighborhood Facebook group, where a few other residents had posted about receiving similarly aggressive violation notices in recent months, everything from unapproved shed roof colors to a garden gnome supposedly violating a decoration ordinance that didn't actually exist in the current guidelines. When our case was called, I walked up with a folder thick enough that I noticed a couple of board members exchange a glance. I laid it out step by step. First, the certified county site plan showing our exact driveway design as originally approved for Phase 1 construction. Second, the subdivision phase map, showing the clear geographic boundary between Phases 1, 2, and 3. Third, the current HOA design guidelines with its recorded adoption date, 3 full years after our home was completed. Fourth, the governing declaration's grandfather clause, highlighted and tabbed. Fifth, my own photographic survey of the neighborhood showing the paver border existed exclusively within Phase 3 homes. I finished by reading a short portion of my attorney's letter aloud, explaining that under the HOA's own governing documents, our driveway was legally non-conforming and protected, not a violation at all, and that continued attempts to fine us or compel reconstruction could expose the association to legal liability. The room was quiet. Even Linda, for the first time in this entire process, didn't have an immediate rehearsed response. One of the other board members, a soft-spoken man named Robert who I'd barely heard speak in the previous meeting, picked up the county documents and studied them for a long moment. "This is a certified copy," he said, mostly to the rest of the board. "This is a public record. If the driveway matches the original approved plan, and the border requirement genuinely was Phase 3 only, I don't see how we can enforce this notice." Linda tried to recover. The current design guidelines apply community-wide. That was the board's intention when we adopted them. Robert didn't back down. Intention doesn't override the recorded declaration. If there's a grandfather clause, and there is, we are required to honor it. Otherwise, we are opening ourselves up to exactly the kind of liability their attorney mentioned. Another board member, a woman named Priscilla, asked a question that changed the entire tone of the room. "Linda, how many of these violation notices have gone out for driveway borders specifically? And were any of them checked against the original phase records before being issued?" Linda hesitated. "I don't have that exact number in front of me." "Can you get it?" Priscilla asked. "I would need to review our files." It came out over the following weeks that at least 11 other households, all in Phases 1 and 2, had received the same violation notice for the same non-existent requirement. Some had already paid fines rather than fight it. One elderly couple had actually spent nearly $4,000 having pavers installed around their driveway because they were afraid of what would happen if they didn't comply. The fallout. The board voted that same night to formally withdraw our violation notice and waive all associated fines. But the story didn't end there, because once the pattern of improperly issued notices became clear, several other affected homeowners started requesting their own hearings, armed with the same county records I had pulled. Within about 6 weeks, the board had refunded fines to 4 different households and formally rescinded 11 separate violation notices related to the driveway border issue alone. The elderly couple who had spent $4,000 on unnecessary paver installation filed a formal complaint demanding reimbursement, which the board eventually approved after another tense meeting. An emergency board review was called, not by Linda, but by 2 other board members concerned about the association's mounting legal exposure. During that review, it came out that Linda had personally drafted and approved the majority of aggressive violation notices over the previous year, often without cross-referencing county records, construction phase documents, or even the association's own grandfather clause. Several residents who attended that meeting described a pattern stretching back well before our driveway issue, involving everything from paint colors to fence heights to, in one memorable case, a mailbox post that was supposedly the wrong style despite having been installed by the original developer. Faced with mounting pressure, a formal recall petition began circulating in the neighborhood. Under the association's bylaws, A certain percentage of homeowner signatures could trigger a special vote to remove a sitting board member before the end of their term. It didn't take long to gather far more than the required threshold. People who had quietly paid fines for over a year, afraid to make waves, suddenly found their voice once they saw that the rules Linda had been enforcing weren't actually being applied fairly, or in some cases, weren't even real rules at all. The recall vote was held about 2 months later in the same clubhouse function room. Linda attended, sitting near the back rather than at the board table. The vote wasn't particularly close. She was removed from the board that night, and the remaining members appointed Robert as interim president. After Linda. Under the new leadership, the board commissioned a full review of the design guidelines, this time cross-referencing them properly against the original county-approved site plans for all 3 construction phases. The updated guidelines, adopted about 4 months later, explicitly grandfathered in original driveway construction while only requiring the decorative paver border for any future renovations, additions, or new construction going forward. It was, frankly, the reasonable version of the rule that probably should have existed from the very beginning. Rachel and I didn't gloat about any of it publicly. We didn't post triumphant updates in the community Facebook group or bring it up at the next barbecue by the pond. But I won't pretend it didn't feel good to see the situation resolved fairly, not just for us, but for 11 other households who had been caught up in the same unfair enforcement. A few months after everything settled, Robert stopped by while I was doing yard work and thanked me, somewhat awkwardly, for pushing the issue as far as I did. "Most people just pay the fine," he said. "It's easier than fighting it." I think that's honestly how it went on as long as it did. I told him I understood that instinct completely. I'd almost done the same thing myself in those first few weeks. It was only the sheer strangeness of the rule, the fact that it so obviously didn't match the rest of the neighborhood, that pushed me to actually dig into the county records instead of just quietly complying. What I took away from it. Looking back on the entire ordeal now, a few things stand out to me. The first is how much power a small governing body can accumulate simply because most people don't push back. Linda wasn't operating with any special legal authority beyond what the board and the homeowners themselves had implicitly allowed her to exercise through inaction. The moment actual documentation entered the room, that power evaporated almost instantly. The second is the value of public records. County site plans, construction phase documents, recorded declarations, these things exist precisely so that residents have a way to verify claims made against them. Most people never think to pull them because it feels like an intimidating, bureaucratic process. In reality, it took me 1 visit to a county office and about 20 minutes with a helpful clerk to get exactly what I needed. The third, and maybe the most important, is that fairness in a community only really survives when people are willing to ask questions instead of just assuming an authority figure is automatically right. Linda wasn't some cartoonish villain twirling a mustache. She likely believed, at least at first, that she was protecting the character of the neighborhood. But somewhere along the way, the enforcement of rules became more important to her than whether those rules were actually accurate, fair, or even real. Our driveway is still there today, exactly as it was when we bought the house, plain poured concrete curving toward the garage, no decorative border in sight. Every time I pull into it, I think about that thin folder of county records that ended up mattering so much more than anyone expected. If there's one piece of advice I'd leave you with, it's this. If you ever receive a violation notice, a fine, or any kind of official-sounding demand that doesn't quite add up, don't just assume the other side has done their homework. Go check for yourself. Sometimes the truth is sitting in a public file just waiting for someone to actually go look at it. I'll add one more small detail, because a few people who heard this story secondhand asked me about it. Walter, the older gentleman who had paid out of pocket for a paver border he never should have needed, was one of the homeowners reimbursed once the board reviewed the pattern of notices. He told me afterward that he almost didn't bother requesting a hearing at all, since he assumed nothing would change no matter what he said. It was only after hearing that someone else in the neighborhood had actually pulled the county records and gotten a violation withdrawn that he decided it was worth trying again. I think about that a lot. So much of this entire situation could have been avoided years earlier if even one person had simply asked to see the original site plan instead of assuming the HOA's version of events was automatically accurate. It's a small, almost boring piece of due diligence, checking a public record before accepting a claim at face value, but it ended up being the single thing that changed the outcome for an entire neighborhood, not just for one driveway. Thanks for reading our story. If you've ever dealt with an HOA situation like this, I'd genuinely be curious to hear how it turned out for you.